The Lunastra space station orbited silently above an uninhabited moon, its polished surface reflecting the distant glimmer of stars. This colossal hub was a meeting point for various species from across the galaxy, a place of diplomacy, trade, and learning. On any given day, you could see diplomats from the cold deserts of Velax or traders from the water-bound cities of Arxio, exchanging goods and knowledge. The station bustled with life, a symbol of cooperation between planets that were light years apart. Among the inhabitants of this sprawling metal city were cadets, young, bright students from various worlds, studying diplomacy, warfare, and technology. Among them was a group of alien cadets, all eager to prove themselves and discover the galaxy's mysteries. One of the cadets was Zark, a green-skinned Threxian from the planet Corton. Zark was curious by nature, perhaps overly so. His species, the Threxians, were known for their intense drive to gather knowledge and their sharp, reptilian features. Zark, with his shimmering emerald scales and 4 sharp eyes, was no exception. He craved excitement, often leading his group of cadet friends into risky situations. On this particular day, Zark and his friends were wandering through the residential sector of Lunastra, a part of the station they weren't supposed to be in. It was restricted to non-cadets, the quarters of visiting dignitaries, travelers, and even the feared Deathworlders, a species they had all heard about, but rarely encountered. Deathworlders were humans, beings from Earth, known throughout the galaxy as one of the most resilient and dangerous species. Despite being physically smaller and more fragile compared to many alien species, humans had an uncanny ability to survive in the most extreme environments. They were feared not because of their strength, but because of their adaptability and their reputation for holding grudges. "You think they're really that dangerous?" asked Ron-Noth, a tall, slender Zephyrian, his deep purple skin glistening under the station's artificial lights. His elongated limbs and calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Zark's jittery energy. "I don't believe the stories," Zark replied confidently. "They say Deathworlders are terrifying, but I think it's just exaggeration. They can't be that bad." The group chuckled as they passed door after door, each leading into private living quarters. As they rounded a corner, they noticed one door slightly ajar. The light from inside spilled out into the hallway, casting an inviting glow. Zark's curiosity piqued. "Looks like someone forgot to lock up," said Yavik, a small, bird-like Crotani with bright feathers that shimmered in the dim light. "Let's take a look," Zark said, his eyes gleaming. The others hesitated. They weren't supposed to be here, and they knew it. But Zark, always the risk-taker, stepped forward. His fingers gently pushed the door open, and the group stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, sparsely decorated, with only the bare essentials. A cot in the corner, a small desk, and a few personal items scattered about. But what caught Zark's eye was a small object on the desk. It was round, metallic, and colorful, a human toy. A spinning top that glowed faintly under the light. Zark approached it with curiosity, picking it up and turning it in his hands. It was an old Earth artifact, something simple but strangely fascinating. The group gathered around him. "What is it?" asked Ron-Noth, leaning in closer. "It's a toy," Zark explained, spinning it on the desk. The top whirled smoothly, emitting a soft hum as it spun. The group watched in awe, captivated by the simple, elegant motion. For creatures used to the complexities of galactic technology, something so basic was oddly mesmerizing. Zark grinned. "I think I'll keep this as a souvenir," he said, slipping the toy into the pouch strapped to his side. Ron-Noth's eyes widened. "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if it belongs to one of the Deathworlders?" Zark waved off the concern. "It's just a toy. Besides, who's going to miss this? It's not like it's valuable." The group was still hesitant, but Zark's confidence and bravado were infectious. They laughed it off, making jokes about how primitive humans were. But as they stepped out of the room and back into the corridor, something shifted. The station, usually bustling with activity, felt eerily quiet. The lights flickered for a moment, and a faint hum filled the air, It was as if the very atmosphere of the station had changed. Zark and the others noticed it, but none of them said anything. They walked quickly, eager to get out of the restricted area, and back to the safety of the cadet quarters. As they made their way through the station, Zark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced over his shoulder several times, half expecting to see someone following them, but the corridors were empty. Still, the unease lingered. Back in the cadet quarters, Zark proudly displayed the toy to the rest of their group. It spun on the table, its soft hum filling the room. The cadets gathered around, joking and laughing, each taking turns to spin it. But then, without warning, the station's emergency lights flashed red. A deep, ominous voice echoed over the intercom. "Attention all residents. Unauthorized activity detected in Sector 3. Lockdown initiated. All personnel are to remain in their designated areas until further notice." The cadets froze. Sector 3, that was where they had been. Zark's eyes widened, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. "Do you think it's because of us?" Yavik whispered, his feathers ruffling in panic. Zark shook his head, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. No, it can't be. It's just a coincidence." But the alarms continued, and the station's hum grew louder. It was as if the very walls of the station were vibrating with tension. Zark's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the toy. Suddenly, it didn't seem so harmless. The others were looking at him now, their earlier amusement replaced by fear. Ron-Noth stepped closer, his long fingers trembling. "Zark, maybe we should put it back." Before Zark could respond, the door to their quarters slid open with a hiss. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure clad in a sleek black suit, his expression unreadable behind the visor of his helmet. He was a human, a Deathworlder. His presence filled the room with a chilling tension, and the cadets instinctively took a step back. The human stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Zark. Without saying a word, he reached out his hand, palm up, waiting. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the spinning top, still turning on the table. Zark's throat tightened. He reached into his pouch, his hand trembling as he pulled out the toy. The moment it was back in the human's hand, the alarms stopped, and the room returned to its usual calm. The human turned and left without a word, the door sliding shut behind him. The cadets stood in stunned silence, too shaken to move. Zark's heart raced. He had heard stories about humans, about how fiercely they protected what was theirs, but he had never believed them. Until now. "Never again," Zark whispered to himself, his hands still trembling. The silence that filled the room after the human left felt heavier than the alarms that had blared just moments before. Zark stood frozen, his heart still pounding in his chest, the fear from the Deathworlder's presence slowly turning into cold, sharp dread. His friends, equally shaken, looked at him as if waiting for an explanation, some reassurance that everything would be okay. But Zark had nothing to offer them. He could only stare at the now empty doorway, replaying the event in his mind. The Deathworlder had taken back his toy without a word, but the look in his eyes, cold, calculating, lingered with Zark. For the first time in his life, he felt truly insignificant. The cadets of Lunastra Space Station were supposed to be the best and brightest of their generation, the future leaders of their respective worlds. But in front of that Deathworlder, they had been nothing. What just happened? Yavik's soft voice broke the silence. His feathers were still fluffed up in distress, his small frame trembling. "I don't know," Zark replied quietly, his voice betraying his confusion and fear. "He just took it." Ron-Noth, always the calmest of the group, was pacing the room, his long limbs moving with an anxious energy that was uncharacteristic for the usually composed alien. "We need to report this. The station's security shouldn't be involved over something as small as a toy. This is absurd." "No," Zark said, sharper than intended. "No one reports anything. We were in the restricted area. We weren't supposed to be there." Ron-Noth stopped pacing, turning to face Zark with a frown. So what? You think they're going to punish us for wandering around? We're cadets. We weren't doing anything illegal. His eyes narrowed, clearly disturbed by Zark's panicked reaction. Zark shook his head. You don't understand, he said, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might hear. That wasn't just any human. That was a Deathworlder. And we took something from him. Something as meaningless as a toy, Yavik pointed out, though the tremor in his voice made it clear he didn't entirely believe in its insignificance anymore. Zark sat down, burying his face in his hands. I thought the stories were exaggerated, but they're not. Deathworlders, they're different. I felt it the moment he walked in. The others were silent, watching him, waiting for him to continue. Zark took a deep breath, looking up at them with wide, haunted eyes. That toy, whatever it was, wasn't just an object to him. We crossed a line. I don't know how, but we did. Ron-Noth frowned, his skepticism apparent, but even he couldn't deny the feeling that something more significant was happening here. So what now? We sit here and wait for him to come back. Yavik's feathers bristled at the suggestion. He's not coming back, right? His voice was laced with fear, his small body twitching with nervous energy. Before anyone could answer, the door to their quarters slid open again with a soft hiss. The cadets jumped, but instead of the Deathworlder, it was Commander Vaeth, a towering figure with dark, leathery skin and sharp, glinting eyes. His presence alone demanded respect, and the moment he entered, the tension in the room multiplied tenfold. Cadet Zark, the commander said in his deep, rumbling voice. You're to come with me. Zark stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. Commander, what's this about? Commander Vaeth's expression was unreadable, but the way he stared at Zark sent a chill through him. You'll be briefed soon enough. The rest of you, he glanced at the other cadets, remain here. Do not leave your quarters until further notice. The others watched in stunned silence as Zark was led out of the room. The door slid shut behind them with a cold, final click. As Zark followed the commander through the station's sterile halls, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach. Each step felt heavier than the last, his mind racing with possibilities. What had he done? Why was the station reacting so intensely to something as simple as a toy? When they finally arrived at a small briefing room, Zark was met with a sight that confirmed his worst fears. Seated at the table was the Deathworlder Carter, his cold eyes trained on Zark the moment he entered the room. Two more high-ranking officials stood nearby, their faces grave. Sit, Commander Vaeth instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite Carter. Zark complied, his heart pounding in his ears. There was a heavy silence before one of the officials spoke. Cadet Zark, do you know why you're here? Zark swallowed hard, his throat dry. I took something. Something from him. He gestured toward Carter, his voice barely a whisper. Carter's gaze never wavered. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable but his presence suffocating. Zark felt like a bug caught under glass, trapped with nowhere to run. Correct, the official continued. You took something that did not belong to you, and in doing so, you have triggered a very serious incident. Zark's mind spun. But it was just a toy. I didn't mean any harm. It doesn't matter what it was, Carter finally spoke, his voice low and steady, but there was an edge to it that made Zark's blood run cold. What matters is that it was mine. Zark couldn't breathe. He could feel the weight of Carter's words pressing down on him. It wasn't about the toy, it never had been. It was about crossing a boundary that no one had warned him about. Commander Vaeth leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Deathworlders, as you should know by now, are not like other species. They come from a planet where survival is a constant battle, where every day is a fight for life. Because of this, they have evolved to hold on to what is theirs with a tenacity you cannot begin to understand. When you took that toy, you violated something sacred to them. It may seem insignificant to you, but to a Deathworlder, It's a matter of honor. Zark felt sick. His hands trembled in his lap, and his voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't know. Carter's eyes darkened, his gaze piercing through Zark. Ignorance doesn't absolve you of the consequences. The silence that followed was unbearable. Zark's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare, but there was nothing he could say that would fix what had been done. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officials broke the silence. Cadet Zark, you will be placed on probation for the remainder of your time at Lunastra. You will also undergo mandatory cultural sensitivity training regarding Deathworlder customs. Any further infractions will result in immediate expulsion from the cadet program. Zark nodded weakly, too overwhelmed to argue. His future at the academy, everything he had worked for, was hanging by a thread, all because of a toy he had thought was meaningless. As he was dismissed from the room, Carter stood, his cold eyes never leaving Zark's. Remember this, cadet, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Next time, you won't get off so easily. Zark nodded, his mouth dry and his heart racing. He understood now. Deathworlders were not to be trifled with, and what he had taken was far more than just a toy. It was a symbol of something deeper, something primal that he would never fully understand. As he walked back to his quarters, Zark couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. The station felt colder, emptier. His friends were waiting for him when he returned, their faces pale with worry. Well, Rannoth asked, his voice tight with concern. What happened? Zark sat down heavily, his body drained of energy. I'm on probation, and I have to take some kind of training. Yavik's eyes widened. That's it. You're not getting expelled. Zark shook his head. Not yet. But I've been warned. If I screw up again. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood. As the room fell into an uneasy silence, Zark glanced at the spot where the spinning top had once sat, its soft hum still echoing in his mind. He would never forget this day, the day he learned just how dangerous it was to cross a Deathworlder. From that moment on, Zark and his friends knew better than to underestimate humans. They had thought of Earth as a backwater planet, its people as primitive. But now, they understood the truth. Deathworlders were a force unlike anything they had ever encountered, and their boundaries were not to be crossed. And for the rest of his days, Zark never took anything that wasn't his again.